Throughout gaming history, the market has consistently followed the trends set by the best-selling titles, with the top games in their respective genres being replicated over and over by various development studios. In the 90s, before the term first-person shooter even existed, these corridor shooting games were commonly referred to as Doom clones, as most games coming out were exactly that, a copy and paste of Doom. In today's modern gaming landscape, the Battle Royale genre is one that has dominated the scene, with the extraction shooter hot on its heels. As gamers, many of us can relate to the fatigue that comes with seeing these clones over and over again. However, every now and then, a unicorn game emerges that breaks the mold and offers something fresh in an oversaturated market. These games shake up the entire scene and sometimes even create their own genre or subgenre, which then leads to the cycle starting over again, with new waves of imitations. Minecraft, Dark Souls, and even Fortnite are excellent modern examples of games that have achieved this. During the late 1990s, the gaming industry was dominated by id Software led by John Romero and John Carmack, whose every creation turned to gold. Although many Doom and Quake clones came and went during this period, only a few shooter games managed to withstand the test of time and make a lasting impact on the industry. When talking about classic mold breakers, Half-Life is often the first game that comes to many a mind with its immersive story-driven single-player experience. But in today's Dev Dive video, we're going to look at an underdog in the 90s FPS scene. Dynamix was a studio that also created a game that broke the mold and is not talked about nearly enough in conversation when discussing impactful franchises. That franchise is Starsiege Tribes, and today you're going to learn exactly why it's so significant.
Hurry up with that run!
Crap!
Founded in 1984 in Eugene, Oregon by Jeff Tunnell and Damon Sly, Dynamix started out by creating games for Apple computers, Atari, and the Commodore 64. During the late 80s, Dynamix was truly a dynamic studio, creating games across multiple genres and working with multiple publishers. Their first title, Stellar 7, was said to have been one of Tom Clancy's favorite games, and in 1988, Clancy was quoted to have said, "It is so unforgiving, it's just like life." Dynamix worked with Penguin Software, Electronic Arts, and Activision to bring space combat simulators, tank simulators, sports games, including a Caveman Olympics game, Ghostbusters, and Die Hard to the market. In 1990, Dynamix was purchased by Sierra Online, who you may recognize as the publisher of Valve's 1998 classic, Half-Life. Despite continuing to develop games in multiple genres, in the 90s Dynamix began to be known as a flight simulator developer after the success of their game Red Baron. In a Computer Gaming World magazine article, Damon Sly was quoted to have said, "We've been sorta all over the board with different products. I think the success of the Great Warplanes really identified us in the customers' minds with flight sims." However, despite the company's success with their flight simulators, they never allowed themselves to be put in a box, and they continued to have success with multiple genres for many years. The two MetalTech games in 1994 were two of these successes. MetalTech Battledrome and MetalTech Earthsiege are mecha-style simulation video games. While Battledrome had a single-player campaign, its main appeal was the player-versus-player combat arenas. Earthsiege, on the other hand, was the more story-driven simulation of the two. Each of the games were praised as some of the best mecha simulation games on the market at the time. These games also laid the foundation for Dynamix' future in development, as well as what would become the MetalTech Earthsiege Starsiege universe. Finding success in multiple genres had become something of the norm for Dynamix. However, they had yet to break into the first-person shooter genre, even though it had been on their minds for quite some time. In an interview, Mark Fronmeyer, a former lead software engineer at Dynamix, recalled a conversation he had with Dynamix founder Jeff Tunnell sometime in the mid-90s before Quake was even released. Tunnell had told Mark, "We need to do a Doom killer. Dynamix needs to throw down with something that will beat Doom." And while Dynamix did not jump into the FPS scene right away, it was on their to-do list to grab a slice of the blossoming FPS market. After all, making the jump from mecha sim to first-person shooter is not a terribly large leap, considering the camera perspective is the same. Fast forwarding to 1996, Quake was released and the gaming industry was blown away. Like most everyone at the time, former lead game designer for Dynamix Scott Youngblood and Mark Fronmeyer began to play competitive Quake together. Despite how much they enjoyed the game and the deathmatch formula, they always felt that if they made a first-person shooter, they would want to do something more with it. In an interview with The Ringer, Scott Youngblood said, I looked at Quake, and they had these level-based experiences where you could run around and shoot guys in the face, but there wasn't a whole lot to do other than that. Knowing they wanted to do something more than deathmatch, the inspiration for what that would be came a year later when Youngblood and Franmeyer took part in the infamous Red Annihilation Microsoft-sponsored Quake tournament in 1997. Close to 2,000 players competed to win John Carmack's 1987 Ferrari, and it was Dennis Thresh Fong who emerged the victor. One of the strategies that set Thresh apart from the competition was his constant use of rocket jumping, firing a rocket at your feet and propelling yourself upwards with the blast. This addition of vertical play to a game that was mostly horizontal left a significant impact on Scott Youngblood. The Quake rocket jumping inspired him to add jetpacks as a foundational feature to Dynamic's new FPS title, which then had been codenamed Fear. With the addition of jetpacks, the game needed levels that could utilize this newfound verticality and diverse navigation. This led to the creation of very large outside levels with rolling hills, and while jetpacks were a planned feature of the game, Fear, now known as Tribes, had an unplanned discovery that changed the entire direction of the game. A programmer for the game, Dave Moore, was working on level collisions and character movement and discovered a bug, except this bug was different. This one was adding something interesting to the game. Moore approached Scott Youngblood and showed him how to trigger the bug, stating that he was not sure if it should be fixed because it was kinda cool. What had been discovered was that if the player was on top of a hill and jumped down, but the jump button was held down, this would cancel the collision with the landscape, allowing the player to accelerate down slopes with no friction. This would then launch the player into the air, and combine that with jetpacks, the player was able to obtain much higher speeds and altitudes than was possible with just the jetpack alone. Youngblood admits it was all wrong, but it made the game significantly more fun to play, so he told Moore not to fix it, and it would become the main feature of the game. This new movement was dubbed skiing, and it is arguably the main mechanic that set Tribes apart from other shooters. Before Tribes, Scott had designed an actual skiing game called Front Page Sports Ski Racing, built on the same Dark Star engine as Tribes, so it was a very serendipitous moment in the game's development. This skiing mechanic permitted players to travel so fast that it made the game's vehicles relatively irrelevant, but it also made Tribes more tactically rewarding, fun, and it raised the skill ceiling for those who were willing to master it. Tribes was set in the same universe as the Metaltech Earthsiege games and was a sequel to the game Starsiege. And although Tribes was supposed to include a single-player campaign to tie the universes and games together, it shipped without one. This made it a multiplayer-only FPS title, which at the time was incredibly risky. This meant that Tribes was one of the first ever FPS titles not to have a single-player story experience, and Dynamix took this risk before id Software did with their infamous Quake 3 Arena. To put this risk into perspective, in 1998 only 26% of US households had internet access, and out of that 26%, only 41% of adults even really went online at all, with an even lesser amount of them playing games. Not only this, but the 56K dial-up modem had just come out, and by the year 2000, only 11% of internet users had something faster than 56K. This meant that a multiplayer-only shooter with expensive environments and rapid travel in a time period where bandwidth was slower than slow was borderline suicidal. Yet Dynamix was able to persuade publisher Sierra Online to go for it, and so Tribes was greenlit to go to market not long after another Sierra Online product you probably heard about, Half-Life. At E3 in 1998, Dynamix purposely set up their booth right next to the Half-Life booth. Everyone would be playing Half-Life, but then hear about the commotion that was Tribes and they would scope it out. When demoing the game, Scott Youngblood would start in an interior room that looked just as good as Quake, but when he went outside, the magic happened. Gamers saw this huge terrain that could be navigated with a jetpack, and it blew their minds as nothing like that had ever been seen before. Starsiege Tribes was released in December of 1998, almost exactly a full year ahead of Quake 3 Arena. The age of multiplayer-only titles had hit the gaming market, and while Tribes sales were mediocre, it was still successful. Dynamix wanted people to play their game, so they didn't even add copy protection to their product. They wanted the game to be pirated, and pirates came in droves. It's impossible to know the amount of people that pirated the game, but it was a significant number of players. When Quake released in 1996, its network code was originally designed for low latency LAN play, and this caused it to be almost unplayable over the internet until the code was updated. X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, which was a multiplayer-only game that released in 1997, suffered from severe lag in online play, and a single-player expansion had to be released to satisfy displeased customers. Tribes, however, was praised for its network code, and this allowed the game to really thrive. The networking model was a marvel, and it supported low-end model connections and was designed to deal with low bandwidth, high latency, and intermittent packet loss. Under the most ideal conditions, Scott Youngblood claimed that Tribes could support up to 128 players, which was almost unfathomable in the late 90s. And while I'm not going to sit here and pretend to know anything about networking connections, the 2015 textbooks, Multiplayer Game Programming, noted that the model used in Tribes still has a great deal of validity and remains relevant to the modern day action genre. In other words, some games today don't have as good of networking as even Tribes did back then. Not only was Tribes' network code a marvel, but the game paved the way for the future with its gameplay as well. Tribes allowed players to select their armor and weapons, deploy turrets, and activate particular power-ups. In a sense, this was an early model of a class-based shooter, and nothing had been done like this in the industry before. It allowed players to tailor their playstyles and created a very dynamic experience. In addition to the class system, Tribes offered several team-based non-deathmatch modes, such as Capture and Hold. This game mode is now a staple of all point defense games like Battlefield. Yet for all of its innovations, Tribes was a challenging game with quite the learning curve. Jetpacks, skiing, long-distance combat, classes, objective-based game modes, and even a top-down command screen to plan attacks made it more intimidating for new players to pick up and play. Casual fans struggled with a game like Tribes, and they still do today. As for those who were devoted to competition, they deeply impacted the creation of the eSports scene. Quake is considered the first ever eSport game, but Tribes was hot on its heels. While its community was small, it did give rise to hundreds of clans that competed in 10 vs 10 tournament ladders hosted online by websites. Dynamix also included the ability to record demos and watch them back, which further improved the competitive scene. Because of the eSports popularity of Tribes and its complexity, it became the first ever game to be shoutcasted, aka broadcasted commentary of a competitive game. The very first organization to do shoutcasting in a semi-professional manner was the Tribes Shoutcast Network, with DJ Wheat, a former director at Twitch, starting his career shoutcasting with the TSN. Shoutcasting was a new way for fans to interact with the game, and it was a way for new players to learn the game as well. In 1999, the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a non-profit organization composed of industry professionals, nominated Tribes for Computer Action Game of the Year. It lost a half-life, and it also named it Online Action Strategy Game of the Year, while PC Gamer US awarded it a prize for Special Achievement in Innovation. For people who played the game and understood what it was and how much influence it had on the rest of the games that followed it, it was absolutely a success. Tribes had started a new subgenre, which was informally come to be known as fps-z, a shooter with a heavy vertical component, the Z standing for the Z-axis. Dynamix would continue to support Tribes while also developing the less long-lived Tribes 2 in 2001. Sierra Online began to restructure as its business model was failing, and unfortunately Dynamix would be closed not long after the release of Tribes 2. Yet another talented studio closed due to the failures of its publisher, a tale as old as gaming time. The Tribes franchise would be licensed to Irrational Games, who created Tribes Vengeance in 2004. The core of Dynamix would form Garage Games, who negotiated with Sierra for the source code of the Tribes 2 engine. This would become the Torque game engine and was available for anyone for fees as low as $100 US. Garage Games used the Torque engine to create a Tribes copycat game called Legion's Overdrive in 2008. Garage Games recently closed in 2022, largely in part of being unable to compete with the Unity engine. The legacy of Tribes still lives on today. Hi-Rez Studios acquired the intellectual property and released Tribes Ascend in 2012. Scott Youngblood, under Red 5 Studios, designed his own Tribe-style game Firefall in 2014. However, despite these clones or attempts at rebooting the fps-z, people kept going back to the original because none of the sequels could capture the speed and physics. According to veterans, original Tribes feels better, more fluid, and is just faster in general. Yet still, some are trying to recreate that magic and bring Tribes into the modern day. While it won't be an fps-z game, Prophecy Games is currently working on Starsiege Dead Zone, an extraction shooter set in the Starsiege Tribes universe. In more recent years, Archetype Studios published a crowdfunded Tribes copycat called Midair in 2018, but due to the game not making much of an impact, development stopped on it pretty quickly. A new studio called fps-z Studios has purchased the rights to Midair and are now developing a sequel, Midair 2, which is what inspired me to make this video. I've actually already showcased this video on my channel, so please look in the video description for a link to that video if you're interested. We are getting towards the end of the video, but before I'm ready to conclude, I want to circle back and discuss one more huge impact Tribes had on the gaming industry, an impact that has indirectly affected close to 58 million people. Ben Beckwith is the primary level designer at Psyonix, the studio that makes Rocket League. Beckwith is a Tribes devotee, and it is the first competitive game he ever played. After Tribes came out, Beckwith and his brother discovered a mod called Tribes Football, where two teams battled over control of an ammo pickup that acted just like a ball. The rules are basic while the player movement mechanics are deep and skillful, just like Rocket League. Beckwith's love of Tribes Football led him to discovering Deathball, a mod for Unreal Tournament 2003. A field he designed for that mod directly inspired Beckwith Park, a level in Rocket League. And while working for Psyonix in 2003, Beckwith began working on the Unreal Tournament 2004 vehicle-based game mode Onslaught. Ben calls Onslaught a condensed Unreal version of Tribes. And now that he mentions it, I remember playing Onslaught as a kid and thinking to myself that it had a Tribes vibe to it. Beckwith drew on his history of Tribes to design Onslaught's levels by adding jumps for vehicles to do midair tricks off of. These tricks later would inspire the codebase for the physics in Psyonix title Supersonic Acrobatic Rocket-Powered Battle Cars, the 2008 predecessor to Rocket League. SAR PBC was originally a car battle game, and during development, Psyonix founder Dave Hagwood worried it was too shallow, so Beckwith decided to create a Tribes football experience into the game. Once the studio realized it was more fun than anything else they'd created thus far, that is what became their new focus. Today, Rocket League has been played by over 58 million gamers according to Psyonix, and according to Ben Beckwith, that's how Starsiege Tribes influenced almost every aspect of my work on Rocket League and my entire career. So basically, without Tribes, Rocket League would not have existed. So let's recap. Dynamix brought us one of the most influential first-person shooter games of all time. I don't feel they get the credit they deserve, and I hope this video helps shine a light on that. Tribes was one of the first ever multiplayer-only first-person shooter titles. It had amazing network code that was considered revolutionary for the time. It was the first game to pioneer a class-based system with players able to select their loadouts. It was the first game to pioneer non-deathmatch modes such as Capture and Hold. It was the first game ever to be shoutcasted semi-professionally, and it created its own subgenre, the fps-z, that while niche is still played today by thousands of gamers. And it was a huge inspiration to Rocket League, one of the most successful sports games of all time. Thanks for watching, everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to check out this content. As I mentioned, I have another video on my channel about Midair 2, a current fps-z game in development trying to keep the Tribes legacy alive. I will put a link to the video in the description, so please check that out as the community is very passionate about their game and I am eager to help spread the word. Please don't hesitate to subscribe if you haven't already and like this video as well. As always, I'm Salty Octopus and I'll see you in the next one.